From basement demos to selling out Madison Square Garden in minutes, the Black Keys carved out one of rock's most unlikely success stories. With 3 consecutive top 3 albums on the Billboard 200 and a full decade of mainstream success, their name became almost impossible to ignore. But what most people don't know is just how close they came to losing it all before it even began. Terrified it might all amount to nothing. Their journey is a roller coaster of obsession, chaos, and unexpected twists. Years spent crammed into a minivan, a hit song nearly scrapped, and a secret rap album most fans have never even heard of. This is the story of how obsession, chaos, and a little bit of luck turned 2 nobodies into rock legends. It all started on a quiet street in Akron, Ohio in the 1990s. 2 future rock legends were growing up just a few doors apart, but they weren't exactly friends. Dan Auerbach was an extroverted guitar kid and captain of the football team, while Patrick Carney was more of an awkward introvert who was happiest when left alone. So they weren't exactly close. There was nothing in their lives pointing them towards each other. Music was the only thread between them, a faint spark that would soon bring them together. Each of them had started picking up instruments just for fun. Dan was glued to his guitar, Patrick was teaching himself recording, and both were equally hooked on music from artists like Junior Kimbrough, R.L. Burnside, and even the Wu-Tang Clan. Their paths finally crossed thanks to their brothers, who actually were friends.
My brother was like, Mike's brother, Pat, he plays drums and, you should go over there and play music with him sometime. And then we just did it.
At first, it was nothing serious. Dan would swing by to mess around on guitar, Patrick would tinker with his 4-track recorder. And for a long time, it was really just 2 kids killing time with music. And it could have ended there forever. For a while, it basically did. They drifted out of each other's lives after high school. They both ended up at the University of Akron, but Patrick mostly coasted through classes and bounced between side jobs, while Dan tried to juggle school and music. Before long, Dan dropped out and bet his entire future on music, taking whatever small gigs he could just to get by. But he soon realized that to get serious opportunities, he would need a demo. And that's when he thought of Patrick. Carney agreed to help record and the 2 set a date. But while Dan showed up, his backing band never did. Rather than canceled, Patrick slid behind the drum kit, even though he hadn't played in years and never really thought of himself as a drummer. But that split-second choice would change everything.
I bought a drum set so that I could have people come over to my house and play drums while I play guitar, but Dan was so good that I just ended up getting sent over to the drum set.
It was supposed to be a one-off demo, and honestly, it could have ended right there. But what happened next? Well, let's just say it made their entire career possible.
And at the time, I wasn't really sure what it was. It wasn't like we were starting a band.
What you're hearing is 2 guys just completely making it up on the fly. And it was fun.
That session, completely by accident, became their first demo. The tape created simply to help Dan land better gigs would end up kickstarting their entire career, but only after nearly being lost to obscurity. They still didn't think of themselves as a band, but within a few days, Dan called Patrick with an idea that sounded crazy. What if they sent it out to record labels and tried to get signed? That single call would pull their basement jam out of obscurity and set the stage for their first real shot at survival. Before they could send out their demo, they needed a name. And like everything else at that point, it didn't come from a plan. It came from chance. There was an artist living in their neighborhood with schizophrenia, someone both of their fathers would occasionally help out. Apparently he had this habit of leaving rambling messages on both of their answering machines asking for things.
So we'd get home from school and it would be like, Chuck, you better bring me pipe tobacco and crayons, and if you don't bring them, you're a Black Key. And so when we were trying to come up with a name, Pat suggested Black Key, and it was instantly, I knew exactly what he was talking about. That was it.
Once we decided we were going to form the band, that was the only name that was ever considered.
It was weird, random, almost meaningless, but it was fitting, because at the time this band barely existed at all. With their new name in place, they stuffed a handful of demos into envelopes and mailed them out to every indie label they could find. Weeks went by with nothing but silence. But just when it seemed like the tapes might end up in the trash, one letter came back. Alive Records, a tiny label out of California, wanted more. For a duo that barely thought of themselves as a band, this was monumental. Alive was tiny, and the deal wasn't exactly life-changing, one that would spark trouble later. But at the time, it was the first moment Dan and Pat realized this might be more than just a hobby. So the duo went back into Pat's basement for a proper recording session. In just 14 hours of studio time, they finished recording their debut album, The Big Come Up. And that was the moment that their original basement demo turned into something real. But even after the record was done, it didn't feel real until they played live. Their first show was a blur, maybe 8 people in the crowd, but the room loved it and the venue wanted them back. That little taste of momentum pushed them out onto the road. But what started as a fun side project quickly turned into a grind. Crisscrossing Ohio, playing dive bars in small clubs, sleeping on the floor, and scraping together just enough money for gas. Half the time they were still living with their parents, the other half they were in a van. It was exhausting, chaotic, but in that chaos you could already see the shape of what they'd eventually become. They'd proven they could make a record, they'd proven they could hold a crowd, but the question now was bigger. Could they actually last? The next chapter wouldn't just test their stamina, it would test their creativity, their faith in each other, and whether the Black Keys were here to stay. This is the part for a lot of bands where things really start to pick up. But for the Black Keys, the grind was only just beginning. By 2003, they were spending their days crammed into a beat-up van they affectionately called the Grey Ghost, living show to show.
We made $539, and it was enough money to pay for gas for the whole trip.
We got paid in cash and he slept in the van to guard the cash.
Exhausting as it was, crowds slowly grew, word spread, and their sound began to make waves. But they weren't happy with their label. Alive had been their first break, but it quickly soured. Shaky royalties and bad faith made the band restless. Their next move was risky, leaving Alive for Fat Possum, a tiny Mississippi label on the verge of collapse. But Fat Possum's gritty blues pedigree gave the Keys something they'd been missing: credibility in a scene they were striving to be involved in. But when it came time to record their first Fat Possum release, there was no big studio upgrade. The label gave them an advance for recording, but they literally had to use it just to keep the lights on. And that meant they would be returning to the basement. So in one 14-hour sprint, they hammered out an album that was louder, dirtier, and heavier than anything they'd done before. That album was Thickfreakness. And suddenly they were starting to get recognition. With that recognition came comparisons. The press couldn't resist lumping them in with another two-piece blues rock band, the White Stripes. Whoa, those guys? Please. What Meg and I are doing isn't the same thing at all. They're just a blues band. We're creating a whole world. Alright, shut up, Jack White. This isn't your video. Don't worry, I'll get to you eventually. Subscribe! Anyway, it seemed like not all of the newfound attention was positive. But in all reality, the Black Keys were too busy doing their own thing to even notice. And just as they were finding their footing, an unexpected offer landed. Their first commercial licensing deal. A UK mayonnaise brand offered them €200,000 to use a song in an ad. This would have been huge, easily the most money they'd ever seen. But their manager was against it. Concerned it looked like selling out, he convinced the duo to turn down the offer. At the time, it felt like a safe choice, but looking back, it was a major missed opportunity, especially since advertising would later become one of their biggest breaks. Even with Thickfreakness gaining notice, the Black Keys weren't out of the woods yet. In fact, they were about to experience one of the first big challenges of their career. By the end of the Thickfreakness era, they suddenly lost access to the place their entire sound was born. The landlord had sold the place out from under Patrick's parents. Rather than letting the loss slow them down, they hunted for somewhere new. The duo set up shop in an abandoned tire factory in Akron. The acoustics were rough, the space unforgiving, but it fit their DIY ethos and it gave their next record its name, Rubber Factory. An album that was raw, imperfect, and completely authentic. This was also when licensing shifted everything. After regretting that first rejection, they started saying yes. They were starting to realize that what they had been told by their manager might not be the full picture.
We had little to no money, and we got a Nissan ad for 40 grand a side, and we said yes. We realized though that something happened when we would go play shows after that. When we played that song, everybody knew the song. It became like, oh, we're getting paid to like get exposure. This is like a hack.
For the first time, the grind was finally paying off. The shows were bigger, the checks were real, and their sound was tightening. Their next project would become a major turning point in their career, thanks to a very unexpected collaborator. But before we get there, don't think I'm about to skip over Chulahoma and Magic Potion. The first of which was a tribute album to Junior Kimbrough, and the second their first album with entirely original music. While they don't have much to contribute to the overall story, they still brought us a whole host of bangers. Here's some of my personal favorites. Okay, now back to that collaboration. It came through Brian Burton, aka Danger Mouse, an outside producer known for breaking rules and blending genres. Danger Mouse reached out to the guys with a bold idea to produce an album with Ike Turner, a living legend whose influence on blues and rock was immense. Excited, they dove right into the project, recording a significant amount of material and experimenting with arrangements and new sounds. They were weeks deep into the sessions when tragedy struck. Turner passed away before they even got the chance to meet him, leaving the project in limbo and the keys without a sense of direction. But rather than scrapping the work, the duo tried something else, reworking the very sessions they had started for Ike Turner into what became the next Black Keys album. With Danger Mouse guiding the process, these songs were reshaped into a cohesive record that pushed the band far beyond their basement roots. The process wasn't simple. For the first time, the duo was being pushed to let go of control and let someone else reshape their sound. Every decision became a question. Do they trust the instincts that got them here, or follow Danger Mouse into something unfamiliar? It was a risk, and the whole project could have failed, but it definitely did not. The result was Attack and Release. Licensed under a new label, None Such Records, it was an album that retained the raw power of their early work while expanding their sonic palette. At its debut, it shot to number 14 on the Billboard charts, a first taste of real commercial recognition.
I'll never forget the day that I found out I was asleep on a bus. This is 6 years into our career. We're finally in a bus after being in a van. And I woke up in a parking lot I'm in some little middle of nowhere town. They wake me up and like, dude, your record's like number 14 on the Billboard charts. I was like, what does that mean? What's going on?
It was proof that the seemingly endless grind had finally culminated in a breakthrough. And with that new label in place, Dan got invited to a session at a studio in Los Angeles to meet with another artist on None Such and see about... Nope, not in my studio. You again? You sure love interruptions. It turned out it was Jack White's personal studio. He was still annoyed at the Keys for the ongoing comparisons between their bands, and he wouldn't let Dan anywhere near him. Dan described the whole situation as awkward, but he says he really didn't take offense. It was just another reminder that stepping up in the industry sometimes comes with small bumps. But what lay ahead was much more than just a small bump. Now, if you clicked on this video expecting to hear about Lonely Boy or Howlin' For You, and you've been sitting here wondering who the hell I've been talking about for the last 10 minutes, congrats! We finally made it to the part of the story where even the casual listeners will recognize the songs. But before we get right into the big guns, there's a weird little side project that almost no one saw coming. Blakroc. No, not that. This. The secret rap rock crossover album that most fans still don't know exists. It came together in the late 2000s, a risky left turn when they honestly should have been doubling down. It's another collaboration with Danger Mouse, and it quietly set the entire upcoming decade into motion. The project was unlike anything they'd ever done before, blending their gritty garage rock with hip-hop, working with rappers, and experimenting with beats and sampling in ways they'd never tried. The sessions were chaotic and uncomfortable. At times, it barely felt like the Black Keys anymore, but they left a mark. They took many of the techniques they learned while working on Blakroc and put them towards something that would become massive.
The minute we went to make Brothers, Dan kind of put the guitar aside and we focused on the drums and bass as the foundation for the songs.
That new emphasis on groove and space became the cornerstone of their next record, Brothers, which would change their career and their lives forever. When Brothers arrived in 2010, everything finally clicked. The album rapidly rose to number 3 on the Billboard 200 and introduced the band to a far wider audience than before. Gritty and soulful, yet surprisingly polished, it struck a balance that won over both critics and casual listeners. Astoundingly, its lead single Tighten Up, produced separately with Danger Mouse, almost didn't make the cut.
We'd finished Brothers, and I just remember thinking I don't think we have a single yet. I don't think we have the song. And so over 2 nights, we wrote Tighten Up. Immediately afterwards, Dan and this song sucks.
Yeah, man, it gave us the icks. It was just too catchy. Something about it just felt too weird.
And Leon Michael, our friend, I played him the record. He's like, do you have anything else? And I played him Tighten Up. And he's like, you guys are f***ing idiots if you don't put that on your record.
Leaving it off would have been unthinkable in hindsight. The track topped the Billboard Alternative Song chart at number 1 and earned the band a Grammy for Best Rock Performance. Soon after, Howlin' For You broke out as another fan favorite, climbing to number 5 and flooding radio stations and commercials alike. By the end of the Grammy season, Brothers had taken home 3 awards, cementing the duo as one of the most vital rock bands of the era. But success came with a new weight.
That's the first time I felt pressure. It went quickly from feeling really proud to feeling like, oh, we can't f*** this up.
Their persistence and creative risks had finally paid off. Brothers wasn't just their breakthrough. It was proof they could appeal to a mainstream audience without losing their essence. And at its heart lingered the influence of that strange, nearly forgotten detour into hip-hop. The so-called secret rap album had quietly opened the door to their biggest triumph. Okay, what the hell is that noise? Right. Jack White just couldn't seem to leave the Black Keys alone during their rise to fame. This email, along with a few others, was leaked during his divorce, and it was clear he still wasn't willing to let go of his animosity towards them. And yet again, the duo tried not to take it too seriously. They acknowledged that while it wasn't something they wanted to see, they understood how tough a divorce could be, and that these documents shouldn't have been made public in the first place. Even so, the Black Keys stayed focused on their music. Even with fame accelerating this quickly, they retained the core of what had made them compelling from the beginning. Raw energy, stripped down arrangements, and a keen sense of timing and groove. This foundation set the stage for their next album, El Camino, and a leap into the arena stage. By the early 2010s, the Black Keys had spent over a decade grinding it out. Their persistence and their recent success with Brothers finally set the stage for El Camino in 2011. The album's lead single, Lonely Boy, was an immediate sensation. Its infectious riff, retro swagger, and catchy hook made it a radio staple and a streaming powerhouse, capturing both longtime fans and their newfound mainstream audience. The album itself was just as explosive. El Camino debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200, went platinum, and later won the Grammy for Best Rock Album, with Lonely Boy earning 2 Grammys of its own. Critics hailed it as one of the best records of the year, cementing the Keys' status as rock's biggest breakout act. But the impact didn't stop there. El Camino's success translated directly to the stage. For the first time, Dan and Pat were headlining arenas across North America and Europe. Their Madison Square Garden show sold out in just 15 minutes.
Twice.
Despite their humble beginnings and slow uprise, the duo was now playing to thousands of fans nightly. Yet they still maintained a grounded, casual approach. No elaborate costumes or theatrics, just jeans, t-shirts, and a shared love for the music. They were rock stars in every sense, but they carried themselves with the humility of 2 guys who had spent years scraping together a living on the road. El Camino, the apex of years of persistence meeting perfect timing, was a demonstration that their scrappy, hardworking ethos could sustain and thrive at the highest levels of the music industry. But their ride at the top still wasn't over. By 2014, the Black Keys had reached a peak that once felt impossible. But even at the top, the grind doesn't stop. And sometimes that's exactly the problem. Their 8th album, Turn Blue, captured that tension perfectly. Expansive, psychedelic, and a little moodier than their previous work. It felt like the come down after a decade-long high, and it resonated extremely well with their audience. The record debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200, their first and only album to do so, with singles like Fever and Gotta Get Away dominating radio and proving the band could evolve without losing what made them great. But behind the scenes, that momentum was becoming a weight. Years of relentless touring had left them drained, and the scale of Turn Blue's promotion only turned up the pressure. The joy that once fueled their music had started to feel like an obligation. Within a year, they'd end up slamming on the brakes. Not in defeat, but in survival. For the first time in over a decade, the Black Keys went quiet. But hang on, whatever became of all the drama with Jack White? Well, things had actually escalated a few years earlier when he and Patrick Carney had a late night confrontation at a bar in New York. News outlets framed it like a full-blown fight, while the two sparred over the details on Twitter.
What happened that night was kind of what I said on Twitter, but I deleted it and I told Jack I'd never talk about it. But I'll just put it this way, I'm never the aggressor here. I'm kind of a p***y.
But instead of letting the feud drag on, Patrick says the two actually worked it out.
So when it comes to this Jack stuff, it was just annoying because we wanted to be buddies. You know what I mean? And I am buddies with Jack. We had our little moment where it got heated and we ended up having this like 2-hour phone call where I basically spoke my piece and he spoke his piece. And we understood we were on the same page as far as how I got Dan's back and he has his people's back and it's all good. And I've since then, I've been to Jack's house, I've watched baseball games with him.
So while the feud had escalated to the point of boiling over, it ultimately resolved with something closer to mutual respect. But anyways, back to the main story. After the Turn Blue era, the Black Keys entered a hiatus that would last 5 years. But how did they reach this point? Years of constant touring, recording, and promotion had worn them thin.
We ended up just completely destroying our lives. We had burned the out.
From the outside, their rise seemed fast, with only around 5 years in the spotlight. But as we've now seen, their grind had actually started nearly 15 years earlier. Rather than letting the exhaustion turn into resentment, Dan and Patrick made a deliberate choice and hit the pause button.
So yeah, we avoided a band breakup at all costs. We just took a break. We just hit the ejection seat for a minute, floated through space, and then got back in the shuttle.
There were no headlines, no drama, just silence. Two musicians finally stepping back to breathe, reflect, and remember why they started doing this in the first place. And when they finally came back, it wasn't with burnout, it was with balance. The spark was back, the friendship was stronger, and the Black Keys were ready for their next chapter. And this brings us into what I'd call the Black Keys' modern era. A chapter defined not by chaos or crisis, but by something even more rare in rock: clarity. After 5 years apart, 2 divorces, side projects, and a whole lot of silence, the big question wasn't if they'd return. It was what version of the Black Keys would walk back into the studio. Would they still have that instinctive chemistry? Would the sound still feel like them? Or was the magic only real when they were burning themselves alive to keep it going? It didn't take long to find out. Their comeback doesn't open with a reinvention. It opens with confidence. Let's Rock is exactly what it sounds like. 2 old friends walking back into a room and realizing the spark was still there. And critics took notice. Reviews weren't calling it their best work ever, but they were saying something even more important. The Black Keys were still the Black Keys. For a band coming out of a near breakup by exhaustion, that's a big win. But almost immediately, they changed things up with a surprising choice. Instead of chasing modern radio fame, their next project went backward. Way back. Delta Kream feels a little like a love letter to their DNA. hill country blues, raw grooves, and the kind of music they bonded over long before fame and pressure entered the picture. And while the album earned strong praise, it also marks something deeper. A band returning to the place they came from, not because they needed to, but because they enjoyed it. And somewhere in that reset, they found themselves enjoying the work again, remembering the kid version of themselves who just wanted to make music because it was fun. But just as things felt stable, the pendulum swung again. If Delta Kream was the Roots album, Dropout Boogie was the experiment. A collaborative, mixed bag kind of record. Some fans loved the looser feel, others thought it missed the mark. But the most interesting part wasn't the album itself, it was the tour. The shows had this big, loose, almost communal energy, leaning into the blues side of their catalog, and having fun in a way they hadn't in years. It felt like they were rediscovering one of the best parts of being the Black Keys, playing with other musicians and not taking themselves too seriously. And yet, even in all that fun, another shift was brewing behind the scenes. Ohio Players, an album that sounded like a statement. Big collaborations, bold stylistic swings, hip-hop features that echoed the experimental spark of Blakroc. And the reception? Well, it was complicated. Some listeners praised the creativity and looseness, the sense that the band was finally playing with the walls down. Others felt the songs got lost in the guest spots, like the album was trying to be everything at once. But the real tension came after the release. The band planned a massive arena tour, and it fell apart almost instantly. Soft ticket sales, mismatched venues, and poor planning. Dates moved and shows downsized, until eventually the whole thing was canceled. Not because the band wanted it to be, but because the infrastructure around them buckled. It wasn't just a failed tour, it was a breaking point. A moment where the band realized that the corporate machine they'd relied on for over a decade wasn't protecting them anymore. So they cut ties with their longtime manager. And in a weird way, it became the most Black Keys moment possible. After everything they'd been through, labels, pressure, burnout, and fame, they'd chosen control over the comfort of a system that no longer worked. And that leads us to right now. No Rain, No Flowers arrived quietly, not as a statement to the industry, but as a choice. Their choice. It's not a radical reinvention, and it isn't trying to be. What matters is what it represents. Two artists reclaiming control of their band at a time when most groups their age are slowing down, fracturing, or fading out. And considering everything they've gone through, the burnout, the relentless pressure, the personal strain of living inside a touring cycle, the decision to step back and make music for themselves says more than any review ever could. It's proof that even after everything, the band still came first, and the bond still held. But that brings us to the end, which naturally brings up the question, what's next? Are they returning to their roots again? Pushing into new territories? Chasing big ideas? Here's the truth, we don't know. But after watching everything they've endured, there's something we do know. Whatever these two make next will be the product of two people who have sacrificed almost everything to keep this band alive. The brand deals they turned down, the marriages that couldn't survive the lifestyle, the weight of fame, pressure, and expectations. Normal life became nearly impossible, but the band never broke. After everything, the grind, the collapses, the reinventions, maybe that's the real story of the Black Keys. Not that they climbed to the top or survived the industry era, or made hit after hit, but that through every version of this band, every sacrifice, and every comeback, they never stopped finding their way back to each other. And whatever the next chapter looks like, you won't want to miss it.